Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Dean Reuter, Vice President, General Counsel, and Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. Thank you all for coming today. I see lots of new, unfamiliar faces, so I thank you for joining our discussion today. If you like what you see, feel free to visit the Federalist Society's website and join, or check back for more content and programming later. To begin with, I want to thank Bryan Tramont and Danielle Thuman of Wilkinson, Barker, Knauer on our practice group, our telecommunications practice group, for organizing today's event, in which we're going to hear from acclaimed experts discussing the administration's efforts to modernize and reform commercial space policy and the FCC's approach in regulating it. Our planned introductory speaker, Dr. Scott Pace, Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, is unfortunately unable to join us today as he is on very short notice traveling with the Vice President. In his place, we're very pleased to welcome Michael Beavin. He's the Senior Policy Advisor of the National Space Council, so we're very pleased to have him with us today. And during his distinguished career, he has worked at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics as the Director of Government Relations and Policy, at the Satellite Industry Association as the Director of Government Affairs, and at NOAA's Office of Space Commercialization as a Senior Program Analyst. He's also spent time on the Hill, where he served on the U.S. House of Representatives Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics. And when President Trump chose to revive the National Space Council, Michael Beavin was the choice for Senior Policy Advisor. Please join me in welcoming the Senior Policy Advisor of the National Space Council, Michael Beavin.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the introduction. As was mentioned, Dr. Pace is unfortunately wasn't able to join you folks today. He is on travel, I think, as we speak, on his way to get on the plane with the Vice President. So when the VP calls, you have to go. So thank you, and on behalf of Scott Pace, who we also refer to as the Oracle within the White House, I want to thank the Federalist Society for hosting this event and for the invitation to speak on modernizing American space policy. I hope I can provide some insight into what the administration has done, is doing, and what we would like to accomplish in building a robust space economy. Roughly 1 year ago, President Trump reinvigorated the National Space Council as an advisory and policy coordinating body to the President for space policy and strategy. Specifically, the National Space Council reviews government policies, develops recommendations, and sends those to the President on space-related issues. The last time that the Council operated was during the immediate post-Cold War period, guiding space policy through the transitions during those years. The recommendations and policy changes the Council has provided and will continue working on require an understanding of the current situation internationally and domestically. Today's environment is far different from the Cold War era and the immediate post-Cold War period. Today, there are many more countries, international partners, and commercial actors operating in space. The various sectors of the space industry are changing rapidly, and the President, recognizing this, is taking a whole-of-government approach. The administration's space policy priorities include ensuring we have the capability to deter aggression in space, growing a more competitive economy by streamlining and simplifying our regulatory systems for commercial space activity, and sustaining American leadership in exploration and utilization of space. But our focus isn't limited to just writing policy statements and strategies, but we're also focused on solving problems and spurring actions. As with many White House functions, our job is to ensure the President's priorities are implemented across the executive branch and to resolve policy differences that arise between departments and agencies. The President took clear and direct action in Space Policy Directive 1, which set out the nation's strategic direction for human exploration and leadership in space. Specifically, SPD1 directs the federal government to develop a sustainable program with international and commercial partners to extend human activity to the moon and eventually onto Mars. This policy supports geopolitical leadership through international partnerships and long-term sustainability, with the inclusion of commercial partners. Whereas Cold War-era space exploration policies focused on how much NASA could do alone, today's policies include international partners, from the beginning, not as an afterthought, and expands the role of industry in exploration efforts. The President also took clear action in Space Policy Directive 2. SPD 2 focuses on regulatory reform to grow the space economy, including space launch and reentry, commercial remote sensing, export controls, and also tasks the Department of Commerce with reporting on how to ensure our spectrum policies, both domestically and internationally, enhance the competitiveness of our space industries. Space Policy Directive 3 focuses on space traffic management, or STM. A well-coordinated national STM strategy will ensure America leads in shaping the norms of behavior to protect the space domain. As the President has said, the exploration and development of space represent the best of American values, and we seek to ensure those values have a permanent place beyond Earth. Regulatory reform is necessary to grow our economy in space as well as on Earth. In particular, reform is essential to keep up with the rapid rate of technical and market change in the space economy. For example, launch regulations created long ago for expendable rockets are not well suited for the use of reusable rockets launched many times a year or rockets carried aloft by aircraft. Remote sensing regulations created for a few electro-optical remote sensing satellites do not work well for large Earth-observing satellite constellations. A major challenge for all satellite services, and especially for communication services, is access to spectrum. I'm going to speak a lot about spectrum now. Satellite signals arrive at the surface of the Earth at relatively low power compared to terrestrial systems, and the spectrum bands they use need protection from interference. Satellites are increasingly capable, with high-throughput satellites delivering terabytes per second in 5G-level broadband services. Communication satellites in GEO will soon compete with constellations of perhaps hundreds or even thousands of satellites in LEO. They operate in many frequency bands, C, S, Ka, Ku, L, and increasingly higher frequencies such as Q and V bands. Entrepreneurs are even developing optical communication platforms using lasers for high-capacity links in space and to ground stations. Space-based communication services are distinctly different from terrestrial systems. As a result, space systems have historically received specialized consideration from spectrum regulators. For example, 17 of the 30 uses of radio spectrum defined by the NTIA, such as mobile satellite service, contain the word satellite or space. Moreover, national space policy recognizes the unique nature of satellite services and directs that the radio frequency environment for critical U.S. space systems be sustained, rather than limited to the band of frequencies allocated for a particular space service. So it's critical that all stakeholders, regulators, service providers, users, understand and consider the detailed technical characteristics of each use of radio spectrum in any regulatory decision. Regulatory instability is bad for business and can be especially lethal to satellites if regulations are not internationally harmonized. Satellite signals, as we all know, do not stop at borders and offer unique global and regional coverage. Satellite regulation requires a global and regional approach, most importantly at the International Telecommunications Union. Small satellites have become a driving force in recent years, with entrepreneurs launching and planning constellations of various sizes. While a small satellite's timeline from design to operations is significantly less than conventional satellite systems, the regulatory complexity and pace remains slow and cumbersome. The international regulatory scheme at the ITU is ill-suited for such short-duration systems. The ITU's typical satellite regulatory coordination process takes up to 7 years. However, small satellites can be built and launched over a period of just a few months with an evolving technology improvement cadence similar to smartphones. While there are some efforts to address short-duration missions in the agenda items for the upcoming 2019 World Radio Communication Conference, small satellite builders face a confusing environment. In addition, spectrum management and regulations can be an afterthought for some new entrants who are surprised by the long time requirements of the formal satellite regulatory coordination process. The entire mission life of a small satellite may end before the ITU international coordination process is complete. Informal coordination can work today, but may not be able to keep up with the demand in the future. And although there are increasing calls for spectrum sharing, there is no common understanding accepted by all parties with disparate radio spectrum usage. It is likely that a one-size-fits-all measure will find general acceptance given the diversity and complexity of radio spectrum uses. It's unlikely that a one-size-fits-all measure will find. Similarly, segmented band sharing targets or quotas for sharing are unlikely to work and may detract from optimizing spectrum use intensity through more advanced sharing techniques. Some services are inherently incompatible unless separated, sometimes widely separated in frequency. Space systems have unique spectrum needs that may be incompatible with terrestrial systems, particularly those that are widely deployed and operate at power levels that are orders of magnitude above that received by satellite signals. Interference prevention and management is a crucial challenge for long-term sustainability of space-based systems. Powerful terrestrial systems in close proximity to bands used by incumbent satellite systems and their ground facilities are problematic. The resulting interference considerations must account for all potential interference mechanisms, including out-of-band emissions and overload of adjacent band receivers. Ignoring any of these well-known interference mechanisms risks ushering in an era of might makes right spectrum management, where the applicant with the highest power signal is allowed to dictate terms to long-standing incumbent users. Commercial terrestrial users are pushing into higher millimeter wave frequency bands. These higher frequencies appear attractive to those market entrants interested in launching high-capacity, high-speed, low-latency wireless networks. In 2016, the FCC adopted new rules for wireless broadband operations in frequencies above 24 gigahertz. The US is the first country in the world to make this spectrum available for next-generation wireless services. The rules balance different spectrum use approach, including exclusive use licensing, shared access, and unlicensed access, in order to meet a variety of different needs and use cases. The FCC also adopted other flexible service and technical rules to allow new technologies and innovations to evolve and flourish without needlessly prescriptive regulations. However, caution is warranted in some of these bands, as some of these bands are currently used by the space community, and sharing could be problematic for sensitive satellite receivers. The composite effect of terrestrial systems could negatively affect the noise floor in space-based receiving systems, depending on the specific case. This could potentially impact important side missions conducted by NASA or other space agencies. Excuse me. Software-defined radios present even more policy issues. Some satellites, today mostly small LEO satellites, are designed with software-defined radios, which can adapt frequency usage dynamically and may open the door over time to new regulatory approaches to spectrum sharing. However, many legacy satellites without the ability to adapt to different areas of spectrum will be on orbit for decades to come. Transmitters capable of operating across wide frequency bands are certainly attractive for their flexibility, but these same transmitters could be sources of interference or jamming if allowed to operate across spectrum used for satellite services. Carefully thought out regulatory implementation of these new spectrum access technologies and techniques is imperative. Dynamic spectrum allocation models and artificial intelligence techniques can potentially solve some of these problems. There are opportunities to apply AI to spectrum management processes to create more adaptable sharing structures. Over time, it may become possible to evaluate real-time spectrum use data and reallocate scarce resources using bidding processes or other pricing models. However, multiple constraints and sources of technical lock-in will require a gradual transition. These techniques are worth exploring, but are not mature enough to risk their use in spectrum bands where disruption could have global economic consequences. Finally, new cloud-based architectures to improve communication and spectrum efficiencies, where the cloud acts as a central unit for signal processing and procedures that are executed centrally could emerge. Cloud-based architectures could produce cost efficiency solutions for increasing the capacity of both terrestrial and space-based communication networks, or some combination of the two. Blockchain-based distributed ledgers could facilitate some of these new models. U.S. satellite capabilities are vital to our national security and our ability to meet new international economic challenges, such as 5G. The international contest for spectrum between terrestrial and space services will be an important part of the next World Radio Communications Conference in 2019. At this meeting, the United States will be working to identify more spectrum for terrestrial 5G users. At the same time, we'll be working to ensure a stable, harmonized international regulatory environment for satellite services meeting government and private sector needs. Ensuring access to satellite broadband services is crucial to meeting the needs of mobile, rural, and developing country users who may find terrestrial-based services either uneconomic or impractical. The U.S. needs a mixed strategy of satellite and terrestrial systems to achieve the most comprehensive posture. Global leadership in telecommunications will depend on leadership in 5G service and technologies using satellite and terrestrial networks. To this end, we'll be working to ensure adequate protection and spectrum access for satellite service and new spectrum access for terrestrial broadband services. We will not engage in industrial policy games depicting technological national champions on Earth or in space. In summary, space services and emerging satellite communication systems are the leading edge of the commercial space industry and vital to U.S. leadership in space. Modernizing our regulations to ensure satellite companies operate under the U.S. flag and are able to compete internationally is a high priority for the National Space Council and our colleagues across the executive branch. We have great challenges and even greater opportunities ahead, and with your help, we will ensure U.S. leadership and values continue to lead the world. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today, and I have time for some questions if anyone has any. I understand there's a mic that will be traveling. Thank you. It's the farthest distance.
Hi. I think it's... Thanks. Okay. All right, I'll just yell. Hi, Caleb Henry here from Space News. I have two questions. The first is, will the National Space Council be attending the World Radio Communications Conference in 2019 in Geneva? And then the second is, will the National Space Council weigh in on the FCC's current deliberations over over C-band, which they just made some new rules about maybe 2 weeks ago?
Can I pass? No. Yeah, so the National Space Council is planning to send folks to the conference. On the second question, I'll have to defer that one. Thanks. I think we had one in the back over here.
Hi, yes, Courtney Albin with Inside Defense. I understand this might be a little off topic, but given the President's direction to the Defense Department to establish a Space Force, I'm wondering what the National Space Council's role might be in helping to inform that process, and if there will be any sort of like working groups or effort along those lines to inform that.
Okay, well, the simple answer is yes, and that work is ongoing right now, actually, as we speak. You can imagine that's going to take up a lot of time and conflict with people's schedules to come speak at events like this. So take that for what it's worth.
So the National Space Council has established some working groups already to
so there's been internal discussion, and that's really all I can say. So C-band and Space Force. Okay. Oh, sure.
What advice, there are many students in the room, what advice do you have to people? There are a number of students in the room, so what advice do you have to young professionals who are considering a career in space policy?
Oh, well, well, I will say there's never been a more exciting time to work in space policy. I mean, it's amazing what's going on right now with everything from commercial to our exploration campaign to all the international partners that really are knocking on the door to do more. They really want to do, come along with us on our journey. And, in the past, and Dr. Pace has talked about this before, it was hard for the international partners to go back to their ministries and say, we'd like to go with the Americans to Mars in the 2030s or 40s. And, that really wasn't an easy sell. So, part of the reason, we're looking at, and the moon's always been there, right? The destinations never change. They've been there for billions of years. But a focus on the moon is, the internationals and the commercial partners can come with us and they can participate and be there, as we lead, they can be there side by side with us and from the beginning too, not as an afterthought. So I really think it's an exciting time. I really don't have any advice. I try not to give advice. Socrates walked around giving a lot of advice and they poisoned him. So I try not to do that. But yeah, thanks again for having me.
Well, thank you, Michael Beavin. Let me call forward now our panel. We're going to have a panel ensue without interruption. We're going to be moderated by Erin McGrath. She's legal advisor in wireless, public safety, and international at the FCC. And I will introduce her with only those words. So, Erin, as soon as the panel's here, you can get going.
Hi, I'm Erin McGrath, and I want to thank you all for being here today. I will take a few minutes to introduce the panelists, and then we will go to the regularly scheduled event. So I will start with Jennifer Manor, who's sitting directly next to me. She is Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at EchoStar Corporation Hughes Network Systems, where she is responsible for the company's domestic and international regulatory and policy issues, including spectrum allocation and market access. She's also worked at the FCC, where I first met her, where she served as Deputy Chief of the Office of Engineering and Technology, Deputy Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and Senior Counsel to FCC Commissioner Kathleen Abernathy. Next to her is Major General Jim Arbor, who is retired, who is the Director of Government Relations for Northrop Grumman Corp. Prior to this position, he has also held positions as Staff Vice President for Washington Operations at Orbital ATK, the VP for Strategy and Business Development at ATK, Space Systems Division, and was the founder and CEO of the Armor Group. He also served 34 years in the Air Force in a variety of space leadership positions, including at the Pentagon, and is a military payload specialist for the Space Shuttle. Next to him is Maureen McLaughlin, Vice President of Public Policy at Iridium. She has also worked as an advisor to senior members of the U.S. Senate, the House of Representatives, high-level administration officials, and independent agencies on a variety of finance, energy, tax, intellectual property, trade, and technology-related issues. And at the very end is, last but not least, is Jennifer Warren, who is the Vice President, Technology Policy Regulation at Lockheed Martin Corporation, where she is responsible for leading the development and implementation of corporate, domestic, and international regulatory and associated policy strategies. Her portfolio includes spectrum, unmanned aerial systems, commercial space launch, and emerging technologies. Prior to Lockheed Martin, she served in several senior roles at the FCC and worked for the Commission of the European Union in Brussels. They have all held other positions too during their careers. They all serve on federal advisory boards, been members of international delegations, and are actively involved in almost all industry trade associations. So, but we don't have all day. So, to start the actual panel, we have all seen major changes in space development during our lifetimes, from NASA's Mercury astronauts, the space shuttle program, and mostly government satellites, to an environment where there's also commercial space launches and exploration, and private sector satellite systems delivering not only services to government users, but also direct-to-consumer video and broadband offerings. So going forward, what is the role for commercial versus government in space development?
I feel like we're to tell the truth. Who's going to stand up first?
Yes.
To talk. Well, you want me? I'm happy to jump
Jennifer.
in. So that's a really hard dividing line, but one area where it seems probably the easiest to focus on is interplanetary missions, deep space exploration. That is a predominantly government-led activity, space development, if you like. I think just yesterday we saw the news where lake water was found on Mars. Right, and Mars is certainly, after the moon, the next target. In fact, earlier this year in May, the InSight program launched from Vandenberg, and it's going to Mars. It'll be the first time to kind of try to explore the interior of Mars, the interior of the planet. So that's pretty exciting. Kind of back to the question that I think was asked, Bryan asked of Mike Beavin. You know, why go into space? There's so much so much exploration going on, and I think that's a role that clearly the government has been leading in and will continue to lead in, at least in the near future. And we've had the privilege of being part of that for the last 50 years.
If I can jump on to Jennifer's, I mean, she focused on the science, and especially human spaceflight part of it, but there's also a military and national security aspect that really is government focused as opposed to commercial. Now, you know, space industries provide all of that. So national security, then there's civil. In addition to the science that Jennifer was referring to, there's also the, you know, what I'll call environmental management, weather, climate monitoring, and, you know, biodiversity monitoring, whatever you want to call it like that, and then commercial. But all of those, national security, civil, and commercial, are based on private industry. It's the bedrock, it's the source of innovation for all of those, whether it's a government or whether it's a commercial mission.
So, and I want to add, just from a purely commercial side, is, and someone who's not as involved in perhaps the space research side as my colleagues are, is government's role should be enabling private sector. And probably the thing that worries us the most is that the government doesn't create a regulatory regime with a light touch that allows the private sector to do what it needs to do to be able to make this commercially successful, because at some point you need to move it away from government funding, even the very early research that's still being done in development, and making sure that the regulatory regime has the right balance.
Just to elaborate a little bit, pick up on what Jennifer said, the lifeblood of the commercial satellite industry is spectrum, right? And so one of the things you need, if you want a vibrant commercial satellite industry, it can't happen without satellite spectrum. And that spectrum has to be free from harmful interference from new incumbents. Innovation's fantastic. We all welcome it, I think, it's fair to say. But you do need a regime in place that when you've invested billions and billions of dollars in your system, that system is free from harmful interference. That's critical for a vibrant industry. And that is a role that the government can set the rules up to help with.
And if I could say, that's true for whoever assets, whether it's commercial or taxpayer assets, that they be able to operate without that interference.
We often talk about maintaining or achieving global leadership in various communication sectors. What would global space leadership mean tangibly for the U.S., and what do we need to do to maintain or achieve that position?
Well, you know, I can give you an example of when we didn't have leadership, and that's when Sputnik was launched, and the Russians put men in space first, and there was a mad scramble on policies and, you know, investment and everything in between. So I really think that, you know, as far as returning to space leadership or whatever you want to call it, it's, you know, a willingness to go out and do things first, set precedents, put policies and organizations in place, and encourage innovation in a commercial industry that sort of, as I mentioned, underwrites all of the national security, civil, and commercial space program.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, and I imagine it's the same across the board here, a strong commitment to space and allowing the innovation to flourish, whether, again, it's government programs, commercial programs, hybrids, really allows for high-tech jobs and jobs that are direct jobs, such as manufacturing, so highly skilled manufacturing made in America, or opportunities to expand knowledge of science. Again, everything's about expanding our roles. We're all good in this now, but it's how do we just continue to improve and what's necessary. And I think building on a point that was embedded in Maureen's, it's what's the environment that the administration creates, what sort of regulatory environment, what sort of investment environment. They're all connected. So the more that it's an attractive environment regulatorily and policy-wise, the more attractive it is for foreign direct investment, for our own investments, et cetera. And that just has not only a direct impact, but also an impact on the U.S. supplier base, which is critical in this country.
And just to add, also taking a role as a global leader will keep companies here in the United States. And I do think that companies will go, for instance, ESA in Europe is a great funder of space research. There's a ton of funding in Europe, and they actively go out and search for companies to partner with, and not having that here actually forces some countries to go offshore to be able to get that support. So I think that's an important thing we want to keep here. We want to keep talent in the United States.
We've already had two people mention that the regulatory framework has to be appropriate for the space environment to really, not to be a cliche, take off. Basically, what steps can be taken to ensure that the United States is the flag choice for satellite launches and regulatory authority?
Can I take it a slightly different way?
You could do whatever you'd like.
So when I saw
I
this,
can't stop you.
so when I saw, well, you could, but you're polite. We're both New Yorkers. I was going to take it to, actually, when I first heard the question, I had thought it was regarding space station licensing, and one of the things, and we are a U.S. we're the largest U.S. geostationary commercial satellite operator, and one of our big concerns is we would love for our satellites to be U.S. flagged every single time, but the U.S. regulatory regime for ITU filings is not as flexible as other countries provide by any means, and the regulatory regime for satellites is probably more regulated than any other service that the FCC does regulate. But things like requiring a bond, large million-dollar bonds to be able to do an ITU filing through the United States, when it usually takes several filings before you're able to develop one as a satellite operator, certainly encourages. And it also harms the United States, I would say, because other countries who are more flexible now are requiring companies to have facilities, including gateways and data centers, in these other countries. So you're seeing more and more satellite operators, even if they're United States, going with other countries as their satellite flags, and then having to put facilities that normally would be in the U.S., which are important for national security, economic, and other reasons, overseas. So I know it doesn't touch on launch, but I think it's kind of part and parcel of the same.
Yeah, so, I hate to come up with another counterexample, but, a decade ago, there were imposed ITAR, international trade regulations against exporting U.S. satellites, and it was overly prescriptive, right? And it fundamentally killed the U.S. space communication satellite business. And for our company in particular, we lost, you could count the satellites that were lost because the U.S. wouldn't subsidize foreign purchase of satellites. And furthermore, that rippled all the way down through the supply chain. So all of the providers of space components went out of business, were reestablished overseas in China or Europe or what have you. And I know the rules were upgraded and sort of mitigated a couple of years ago, but we still have a deep decade-long hole to dig out of. And more relief on those kind of areas would also be helpful, I think.
So just to, if I could pick up on the export control, it's more having a more streamlined process, still to manage it for purposes of national security concerns, but to have a more streamlined process that allows the U.S. companies to compete for the foreign manufacturing opportunities. Not really subsidies involved in that, but I think maybe that was reference to the Exim Bank and the opportunities for the Exim Bank, just as it does for aviation and every other sector, to be able to be a export credit agency so that U.S. companies that are competing with French, Chinese, other space manufacturing companies have access, for their, I should say their customers, have access to that same sort of export control, see, I'm doing it now, export financing access. So thank you.
I guess I'm the Pollyanna here on this panel, because so at Iridium, we're in the process of launching our next generation satellite system, $3 billion investment. We are, I believe, still SpaceX's largest commercial customer, and we just had another successful launch last week, and we've been thrilled. We've been thrilled. The launches went incredibly well. I can't imagine they could have gone better. And the FCC had to license the next generation satellites on the space side, and then separately the updated equipment with our Certus products on the ground side, user equipment. And the FCC process, you're going to pass out. Prior roles in my career, I didn't compliment the FCC, but we don't need to go back and look at that. But in this case, honestly, it was very efficient and highly functioning, and it allowed us to move forward with what we needed to do.
Since we are on the idea of streamlining regulations, as we've already heard today, the White House issued Space Policy Directive 2, the streamlining regulations on commercial use of space. It orders executive agencies to review regulations for commercial spaceflight and remove sensing, spectrum use, and others to ensure rules minimizing uncertainty, protect national security and public safety, and encourage U.S. leadership in space commerce. What role should the companies have, and what role should the government agencies have?
It's obviously got to be a partnership, and I think one of the things that's emblematic in what the administration did with this that they should be commended for is they're seeking industry input on the front end, and by nature of coming out and declaring this is where they're going, and that's critical to have that dialogue open from the beginning, I think.
And I think the fact that the National Space Council created a user advisory group specifically, which is another voice of industry input, that's very important. The fact that the Space Policy Directive 2 contains those directives to specific agencies, I mean, they're not waiting. We're already seeing the results of that, whether it's the FAA having an advisory rulemaking committee leading towards an NPR, a notice of proposed rulemaking on streamlining launch licensing, whether it's the Department of Commerce and its restructuring to increase the visibility of space, and NOAA within it releasing an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on how to streamline. There are actually tangible results already in terms of regulatory direction that we're seeing from the executive branch agencies that are, to Maureen's point, inviting industry input on the front end, and they're taking the responsibility of that kind of outreach with industry to best understand. The role of government is not to be so enamored that they, don't focus on how to ensure it's a level playing field, that the rules, work for everybody, that sort of thing, ensure protection of third parties. So, for example, with the launch rules, right, safety of the public is very important if there's a launch incident that doesn't go right. So there are roles that you expect a government to have, which is the protection of the public and that sort of thing. I think the next thing will be what some of the Space Policy Directive 2 invites the FCC to be part of that, and so we look forward to working with the FCC on what might its steps be, but you're the moderator, so we don't get to ask questions.
Yeah, we've all
And you're previewing the next question.
Yeah, to write on Jennifer's comments, we've all been part of industry associations here, and I really felt like some of our interaction with the National Space Council resulted in SPD3 that just came out a little while ago that talked about space situational awareness and space traffic management. Now, granted, they were baby steps, but there's a focus by the administration on doing this, and they're even talking to legislators about it. So we're seeing pretty strong leadership here that's interactive with industry.
The next question, which Jennifer slightly previewed, was basically how can the U.S. agencies work together to move the space policy directives from concept into action? So if you have any other further thoughts?
So I do, Jennifer's not ready.
Miss Jennifer.
I think the whole of government concept that Mike talked about and the administration's been talked about is really important in this area. You've got so many agencies involved, and you have to get them working together and swimming in the same direction, so to speak. And that includes, to some extent, having FCC input, understanding that they're an independent regulatory agency. But I do think, one of the things I think I had the opportunity to sit down with the head of the Office of Space Commerce this week from Department of Commerce. Reinvigorating that office, I think, is really important. It gives industry another place to go in. And once again, as Jim said, we certainly see the agencies very interested in public comment and taking that into account.
So now we'll move on to another topic that has been obviously garnering a lot of attention. But as innovation is driving the creation of space and aircraft at all altitudes, which in turn increases the risk of collision, what solutions should the government focus on? What about the role of commercial operators? And how can the government and commercial operators best work together to arrive at a solution?
So I'm going to go back to something I said before with respect to the FAA. The FAA has this advisory rulemaking committee process, which is a really unusual one. It doesn't seem to exist in some of the other regulatory bodies that I at least work with. It brings together affected industry members to really work on with the government agency the challenges. And in this case, there is an ARC that is focused on air access for aviation, manned and unmanned, as well as launch or space. And that's a really important ARC and the work that it's doing, because there's a lot of competition for access to space. Good competition, right? We want it all to be able to be done, and it's going to have to involve all stakeholders bringing technology solutions and understanding of how these systems all work. How do drones work? How do planes fly? And what are the launch windows for getting into space, and having everybody understand each other. And you can't do that only through written comments in standard rulemaking processes. So this process that the FAA has is really a very good one to bring diverse stakeholders in a room so you can explain and not have to write treatises and hire lots of lawyers, to write them for you, but can actually have the experts in the room talking to each other. And I think that's a really important process.
Yeah, I've participated in some of those ARCs as well, and it opens up avenues that you hadn't even thought about, like where are you putting spaceports? It used to be the traditional, Vandenberg and Cape Kennedy, but now they're popping up everywhere. Every state wants to have one, and so there's different rules of engagement there. And how do you even authorize one to be there in the first place? So, I mean, it's really a complex and interesting problem.
We take it a little bit differently. So we're in low Earth orbit. We're much closer to the Earth than our satellite brethren, and things fall down, usually, I think. So I work with engineers. I know that now, right? And so one of the real concerns that we have is you hear the term space junk or orbital debris or traffic management. And one of the reasons for that is because we also have experience having been hit by a Russian zombie satellite, very famously. And so as we think about new systems and mega systems and mega constellations coming online, the innovation's great, but I think we have to also think about what's the implication for that. I mean, space is a finite resource. So fun things for policymakers to think about. I'm not going to give Erin the answers. I don't know that I have them, but one of the things you have to think about, so when we are building and launching our system, it's designed to be up there for a while. So we test, right? Because I can't go up and fix it. Well, I can't fix it even if it was down here, but somebody else can't go up and fix it. But if your business model is different and you're planning on you're doing a lower cost model and you're replacing it every couple of years, then that's leading to different choices. So what happens if you're doing 4,000 satellites in a system or whatever it is, and there's a 20% failure rate and they become rocks? What testing are we going to require, or assessment on the front end? Should there be at a certain altitude capabilities for maneuvering, right? So everybody shares the burden. trackability, those kinds of issues. The innovation's great. It's just that these are sort of issues that people are going to have to think about now. And if you do have a high failure rate, right, you could sort of see that possibly could happen if that's the business model, should you then keep launching them? Or does somebody like Erin have to come in and tell you to try and fix it before, if you're up at whatever percentage? I mean, these are just interesting questions that I think that all the innovation is going to lead to us have to talk about.
I wanted to touch on one other piece, which is best practices. I think a very important part of space traffic management should be and will be best practices agreed to among operators. Maybe operators are the same, or maybe operators of different, close, hopefully different, getting together and sitting down. And I know some of the satellite trade associations are working on those now, at least on the commercial satellite side, and trying to find ways that everyone can agree. There's actually a fair amount of international precedent out there. And I have to be honest, we've been doing, personally, I think the commercial satellite industry has been doing a pretty good job, with a few exceptions, like your Russia system, which wasn't really a commercial issue.
But the U.S. operators, right, I think we coordinate pretty well.
I think the non-U.S. operators who are commercial also, have a lot of interest. And with the government, we've been doing a great job working with DoD. So, but I think some of that has to be updated and take into account these new systems and working through best practices, because at the end of the day, some things we're probably better suited to figure out than the government regulators.
And this is kind of bleeding into another topic we're going to talk about, so if I could, can I just bleed in? Which is, the regulation and setting it up front, like Maureen said, some of the questions and the best practices, but in between kind of requirements for operators and the space traffic management is the space situational awareness. So you need to know what's there, and with increasing accuracy and detail. And so an important part of space situational awareness is not only the commercial operators part, which is to feed data and to share data, both domestic and international, because as we know, commercial operators are not uniquely U.S. But the space situational awareness, we need to continually improve the Air Force's capabilities, because right now that's where it is, and they have spent a lot of time and effort on creating a new system called Space Fence, which is going to increase by, I think, tenfold their ability to not only detect but track and predict with a greater degree of accuracy where these objects are going. So instead of being about, I think it's 12,000 to 20,000 objects they follow now, they'll be able to follow up to 200,000 and have like 1.5 million observations a day, which feeding into then what the operators and other users in space need to know is what's real, what's not, that's likely going to get into my way and cause real harm to something that's intended to stay there for 15, 20 years. So there's that interim step, which is really important too. And there's a mix, there's the Air Force component of this, and then there's what industry can do to help with that space situational awareness as well.
So Jennifer's tapping into a huge area here, because, the space situational awareness, space traffic management is the baby step. There's a whole aspect here that is really hindering commercial activity, which I call attribution. I mean, you can count this stuff in space, you can guess at its trajectory, but often you don't know whose it is, or what its purpose is, or what its ultimate destination or reentry is, all of which are different calculations. And until we get a little bit better handle on that attribution, it's going to, I think, hinder creative space businesses like salvage or satellite repair, which our company is investing in, and we can talk about more later. So
It's next.
Yeah. I mean, there have been some attempts to get at that in legislation, but we have a long way to go on that. And I do think having that sort of a space traffic management framework and some light touch regulation is essential for a good and creative basis, for commercial industry in space.
And for the lawyers
It should not be a free-for-all.
And for the lawyers or would-be lawyers in the room, there's also the issue of compliance with the Outer Space Treaty and Article 6, which is having the U.S. designate an entity to be not only the authorizing but the supervising authority for all of these new types of applications in space. And then the point Jim made is really important, is how do you get an agreement on attribution for salvage? So if somebody's abandoned an object in space, does that mean it's eligible for his, AAA service to take it to some junkyard? That's not clear. So there's a lot of articles that could be written in the audience, perhaps.
So since we've already touched on this one, White House Space Policy Directive 3 recognized that space is becoming increasingly congested and DoD currently is tracking 20,000 objects in space. It acknowledges that new ventures such as satellite servicing, debris removal, in-space manufacturing, and very large small-sat constellations are outpacing efforts to implement policies to address these activities. Basically, we can't have things colliding up there, as you have already stated. John, could you briefly describe space logistics, Northrop's in-orbit satellite servicing, and also comment on how the new administration's space policies and initiatives are impacting Northrop's in-orbit servicing plans? And of course, I'd like to provide you all the opportunity to comment further on Space Policy Directive 3 and these issues to the extent that you haven't already stated everything.
Okay, so this could be a long answer because I like talking about satellite servicing. I've been working it for 8 years now, and we're probably 6 months away from launch of our first mission extension vehicle, which will dock with an Intelsat satellite and extend its life. Think of the device as sort of a mobile wheelchair for an aging satellite. It docks and stays attached, takes over the guidance, navigation, and control, and then continues with basically an alert and still functioning satellite that maybe is out of gas or has other guidance issues. Like I said, I've been working on it for 7 or 8 years now. The good news was I had 7 or 8 years to work the policy and regulations and licensing. The bad news is I still don't have the policy, the regulations, and the licensing yet, and I'm 6 months away from launch. Now, that wasn't for lack of trying. In truth, all of the agencies and departments have bent over backwards, been very positive about doing this, and their underlying approach was they want a U.S. company to do this first and set positive, good precedents. So we took on a company policy of transparency, collaboration, and responsibility, right? So we did all of the solid engineering, test, retest. We have a test plan in orbit before we actually move into the geostationary belt where there's a lot of business going on that we don't want to mess up our own sandbox, so to speak, et cetera. So if I can go quickly, we did work with the FAA for our payload safety review. We thought that they were going to do the Article 6 Outer Space Treaty approval, but that's now moved to the Department of Commerce. Maybe the State Department still has a say in that, they think, since it is an international treaty. We got our preliminary license from the FCC for the spectrum for command and control that we use. Actually, we share the same spectrum as our client vehicle, so it's a nice, clean, neat answer there. And we also have permission for the orbital location. Oh yeah, the client has that same orbital location, so that turned out to be a pretty straightforward thing to do as well. NOAA, as it turns out, when we're docking with our client, you can see the Earth in the background. So our cameras that were used for rendezvous proximity operations had to file for a remote sensing license. It's a technicality, but we had to do that. And during the process, NOAA discovered it had a new set of rules on imaging of non-Earth, right? So satellite to satellite imaging. And so that sort of restarted our licensing process. I had hoped they might be stable for a while, but they do move around a bit. That was out of NOAA's process. And I will tell you that NOAA also tapped into the interagency process, which was very helpful because it contacted all of the interagency departments and agencies, some of which I can't name here, and they gave us very good advice on how to operate and how to store data and protect our operations. So overall, it's been a good experience, but the government was starting from a dead cold stop as far as relevant licensing and regulations, and we've been learning together on this. It looks good, and I'll invite you all to the launch. Did I answer the question?
I think you did, yes. There's much talk about wireless 5G and the benefits it will bring to consumers. So what role can the satellite industry play in providing broadband services, and how does the move towards 5G affect current and future satellite operations?
This is my favorite question.
That's why I made sure to ask it, and I will let you start.
So first off, I want to make it clear that the satellite operators and the satellite industry fully supports terrestrial wireless. We use it ourselves. We were all sitting looking at our phones earlier. We all depend on it. But satellite is an important part of the communications infrastructure and will be an important part of 5G, whether it's being a part of backhauling service to the 5G terrestrial providers, whether it's IoT, whether it's machine-to-machine, whether our company's business is very focused on bringing consumer service to rural areas that might, despite some of the claims of the small cell operators, I'm still not sure it's going to get quite everywhere. And certainly we're global, and that brings a lot of benefits in places that it's highly unlikely there'll ever be the economics to build out. So we fully support it. We're going to be a part of 5G, but there needs to be a balance. And when I say there's a balance, it doesn't mean that the wireless industry, terrestrial industry gets 50% and we get 50%, though I'd be happy with that. But there needs to be a balance struck. And I think what we're seeing is that balance isn't being struck. There's certain spectrum where we can share today, and there's certain spectrum that's harder to share. And the spectrum that's hardest to share is spectrum where both the terrestrial industry and the satellite industry are operating user terminals, where you have widely deployed ubiquitous services. It's incredibly hard to share. And so there needs to be a certain amount of spectrum that's available for satellite that isn't used on a co-primary basis on the same basis as terrestrial. It needs to be primary or dedicated or whatever term of art you want to use for the satellite industry. The FCC recognized this expressly in their Spectrum Frontiers decision and put aside some of these waves, the bands, they're called the millimeter wave bands, specifically stated we recognize the satellite industry needs some of these bands, and then some of the bands we're sharing and some are only for terrestrial, and that all seems to work, and we thought it was a pretty good balance. And we were looking forward to going into the World Radio Conference, which Mike talked about earlier in 19, with some sort of plan that was similar. Unfortunately, the FCC has not taken that approach internationally and instead wants to see all the bands made available for terrestrial without regard to protections for the satellite industry, whether it's technical protections that we might need to share or bands where we need exclusivity. And that's been a big issue for us because we are global. Iridium in particular is a great example of a global system. We primarily operate over the Americas, our broadband network. We're regional though, but we provide service all through all through the Americas. If we can't do that, you don't have the economics, the economies of scale to do that. So we do think there's a way forward. We think we're going to be an important part of 5G, but we do think internationally and domestically there needs to be a recognition of this need for spectrum.
Can I just, one of the interesting things is when I started in this a long time ago, we're not going to discuss how many years ago, there was a perception that satellites were rural, right? I mean, that was like, that is true. That is a role that we can play where you can't go with terrestrial. But our largest at Iridium, our largest growth area is Internet of Things. We're in the cities. We're everywhere now. So sometimes it's a challenge when you talk about spectrum allocation of those things. Oh, you guys are rural and other people are in the cities. It's like, no, those are the old days. Now we are there side by side. And sometimes the regulators and the engineering just needs to recognize sharing can't happen. It's a technical thing, it's a physics thing. In certain circumstances it has, and with increased technologies, I think we've seen that over the years, but sometimes the answer is just no. Your out-of-band emissions are going to destroy the investment that's been made by these companies over time, and it's billions. And that, I think, is just an education process that needs to be part of the dialogue.
Well, I just want to add one quick thing, Jennifer, beforehand, is emergency response, because I totally forgot this.
Yes.
Following, we all witnessed the horrible things that happened in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean last year. If you take a look, and we provide service to FEMA, satellite was the only thing working reliably. I know, and terrestrial networks do go out, whether it's, a cable cut, whether it's a hurricane, satellites are there, and if they're not, if we don't have the spectrum to be there, there isn't going to be any service. I'm sorry, Jennifer.
No, that's fine. I was just going to pick up on an earlier thread that Jennifer had started, which is it's not just the amount of spectrum, when she said 50-50 or something thereabouts. It's really not just about the amount, but also, is it spectrum that's already globally harmonized? So as you've heard from both Maureen and Jennifer, we're talking about satellite services that serve more than just the United States, that may serve more than just the region. The satellite industry collectively has spent years, decades actually, working to make sure that spectrum that research and development of technology is going into is actually harmonized so that it's the same globally, so that when that technology is then ready for deployment, after that, the years of testing, et cetera, that Maureen talked about, so that when it's up there, it actually works, that when the satellites go up there, that spectrum is harmonized and provides the economic footprint that's necessary to support the business cases they have. One of the major challenges that we're facing is an effort to fragment the spectrum that the satellite industry has worked so hard to harmonize, to realize that investment and to realize those services, and that is a real challenge. So it's not just the amount, and people will kind of say, well, you could do it here or you could do it there. It's like the technology, the investment in technology development that's so important to get right before you launch has been a decade for some of these new bands, and will be a decade starting now for some of the further bands out. It's a never-ending quest to try and continue to develop technology to exploit more spectrum bands, but there has to be an understanding of the importance of these global allocations.
And I'll throw out one last question because Maureen already touched upon it. But policymakers sometimes don't focus on the overall economic impact of space. I would like to say that my boss, Commissioner O'Reilly, always thinks about things like that. Oh, yes, and he is back there now. Can you discuss your company's impact?
Couldn't hear the last part.
Oh, can you discuss your company's impact
Economic
on the economic impact?
Well, ecosystem is either your favorite word or the most overused word in Washington, depends on the day. But it's a fact that we do support them. So for Iridium, as I said, SpaceX is launching. We have a series, you have a whole supply chain issue when you're making these satellites, and it supports high-tech jobs and those natures, that kind of nature. There's also other, for us, because we are global, there's all sorts of, and the nature of the signal, where we are in the spectrum, there's all sorts of applications for first responders and helicopters and in search and rescue and all those things, but also other major industrial clients. And for us as well, it's secure communications in the cockpit and on the ships, because you can't have, it's not the same as your Netflix buffer, right? You can't have it, you can't have the map coming into the pilot where the problems are suddenly not show up, right? We can't have that. So there's something to be said for secure communications, and that's part of the niche that we do. We have different business models, and that's because of where we are in the L-band. It's sort of a part of the company, also with the characteristics of the spectrum. And so one of the concerns that we have, and it's not just us, GPS has a concern and NOAA has a concern. If you take us as sort of like the satellite consortium, there is, pushing at the FCC for changes so that, like one that comes to mind is Legato Networks to come to mind and change, and right in the satellite neighborhood, let's try and do an ancillary terrestrial thing, which will jeopardize many, many satellite systems. And those are years of investments and years of public goods, then so those services are being provided. And I just think you need to have the certainties to know when you're investing that that's not going to happen.
Jennifer?
So sure. So I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction with respect to the economic impact. So our space company, because Lockheed Martin is comprised of multiple business areas, but our space company is a $9 billion enterprise with about 18,000 employees. That's the first economic impact. The second is that we have suppliers in 50 states representing about $3.5 billion in subcontracts. That's an economic impact. We purchased goods and services, and you can tell I pulled these stats. These are not my regular talking points. From more than 5,000 suppliers across the country. More than 3,500 of those suppliers are small businesses coming from diverse communities in the country. So I let you all who do the economics apply your formulas to that. But that's a pretty distinct impact, and we're one company. A big one, but
Right.
we're
And
one
so-
company in this community.
And Northrop is right behind you, all the way on that. But, you know, the satellite business is a $350+ billion business that covers pretty much every aspect of our lives: GPS, timing, weather prediction, national security. I mean, it affects everything we're doing every day. And so at that level, you know, we're an integral part of that. I will point out, though, that even though we're about an $8 billion, 11,000 person, my satellite servicing business is $14 million. Today. But we hope to take over the universe soon.
So just to add, I'm proud we have about 2,000 employees, so maybe not as much, but not bad for a satellite operator here in with most people here in the U.S. We also we have a manufacturing facility 45 minutes outside of D.C. where we build terrestrial ground infrastructure. So a number of the satellite devices that you use are things that we manufacture here in Maryland. But we also support the DISH network, DISH direct-to-home network, which touches millions of customers across the United States. And we bring programming down to cable head ends and other things in our EchoStar side of the house. And then the Hughes side of the house has over 1.2 million users across the Americas today, providing broadband both to residential and businesses. And every time you go to a gas station and swipe your credit card, we have a significant percentage of those gas stations that's traveled over our satellite system. So there's ways building out with Jimson.
And use the GPS.
And use GPS as well. Sorry. I'm not as technical. But all of that is stuff that you touch every day and that we bring in. You know, I'll tell you, and the reason during Hurricane, not Katrina, I'm sorry, Superstorm Sandy, that things were able to function was because we actually do touch every gas station. We were able to tell first responders where there was gas available. We actually created a network. So things that come up in surprising ways that may not have a day-to-day economic impact, but can have a huge economic impact in getting the country running again.
Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for sharing their expertise with us today. And now we'll move on to the next portion of today's program, which is Bryan Tramont, who will come up here to interview my boss, Commissioner Mike O'Reilly. Bryan Tramont is the managing partner of Wilkinson, Barker & Knauer. Before joining Wilkinson, he served as Chief of Staff of the Federal Communications Commission under Chairman Michael Powell. Oh, that's mine.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you. That was a great panel. Commissioner O'Reilly is in his second term at the FCC, and that has followed a very distinguished career on Capitol Hill, working with the House and the Senate side. So he brings both a legislative as well as a regulatory perspective to some of these space policy issues, and also has been a longtime supporter of the society. So thank you for joining us, Commissioner.
Much appreciated. Thanks for having me.
So as I alluded to, you spent time at Capitol Hill, and then you also obviously are now a regulator. Tell us a little bit about how you got your start in satellite policy. I think it involved my Intelsat privatization, perhaps. Is that right?
That's true. Look at, Capitol Hill is an interesting place. I spent 9 years on the House and 11 years on the Senate. One of my first projects was the privatization effort on behalf of my old boss, Tom Bliley, for Intelsat and Inmarsat. It took us quite a little bit of time to make that happen. It's interesting to see what the market has done with that statute over the years. But on the Hill in general, satellite policy or even space policy is a really narrow universe of people that focus on those matters. A handful on Energy and Commerce Committee, a couple people. You have a Science Committee that focuses on portion of the issues. And then you have, in the Senate, you've got the House, in the Senate, you've got the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, where only so many members care about satellite or space issues. It is really, and I don't want to call it a parochial issue, but it tends to fall to those members who have heavy space or satellite issues within their particular state. I happen to work for a member who had a tiny portion, some satellite stuff in regarding, looking for new planets. As it relates to, and I had a project at Dartmouth, so I spent quite a bit of time on budgeting issues and how to figure out how the reauthorization process would work. But so it is a small universe of people on Capitol Hill who care about these things. I happen to be thrust into them early on in my life. It was a great way to start. And then you kind of jump back here and there, and it has been a great platform for my current job at the FCC.
So pivoting to sort of FCC-specific issues, obviously you guys are very focused on broadband deployment and ensuring all Americans are connected. You've talked about the role of satellite broadband. You want to just share with us your views, and particularly across different policy elements, universal service and spectrum management and things like that, but they all touch on trying to get satellite broadband to more communities at higher speeds.
Well, I think the previous panel, I only caught part of it, but I think they said it well towards the end. That satellite is going to play an important role for the delivery of broadband, both domestically and internationally. There'll be other technologies that they'll be in competition with, but there's definitely a significant role for satellite to bring broadband to the hardest parts of our nation and into the cities as well. We had a debate yesterday in the Congress and an oversight hearing regarding the number of households that don't have broadband in America. And if you look at our data points, and people can fight over the measuring that we use one way or the other, but it's a disagreement between 24 million Americans and 14 million Americans. And I asked, I posed the question, well, what's the difference between the two? And it's 10 million, of course, right? There's a little bit of math. But what's taken up by that, and why do people not count it? And why do my colleagues not use that data point? Well, those are people who are served today by satellite, and they're getting the speeds just to meet our standards and just to qualify as everybody else, and they should count. And they should count, as people are treated for such. So we do have a significant problem of 14 million American households that don't have broadband, but we should not pretend that the satellite industry isn't serving some of those, and will continue to grow as new satellite constellations are deployed in the coming years.
So speaking of new satellite constellations, a couple issues there. So there's a whole bunch of applications sitting in front of you. You guys have been approving a number of them. But how can you encourage innovation while also ensuring that you don't have harmful interference from all of these new systems? You noted in one of your separate statements, I think OneWeb is supposed to have 700 satellites as part of their system, and other providers proposing 4,000 of them. That's a big traffic cop roll. How do you deal with that from your current seat?
Well, it is a really interesting issue to try and figure out how to find commonality. There are, I think the harmful interference issue gets to, some of the questions, the inline interference issue we've been trying to deal with, and I don't know that we've exactly found a good resolution. I think people have raised a lot of problems with where we've actually landed, no pun intended, but I think there are, that is something that probably is going to be modified as we go along the process. I imagine. I don't think that we found a perfect home. But your bigger point is, there are so many constellations that are planned. The real question is how many are actually going to happen. Right. And I try to test that out with people in New York, and when I go to California and in Texas, different places which have predominantly focused on some of these issues, and when I travel internationally, what do you really think can happen? How many? We've got a dozen applications in one category, 10 more in another. How many of those are actually going to materialize? And we try to figure, try to make the best policy we possibly can. But there are, limitations on what the skies can hold. Depending on what bands we're talking about and what we're expecting in terms of cooperation between different constellations. So it is going to be a very complex issue going forward. I don't think we've found the perfect solution yet, but there's more work to come.
So all those satellites also need to be protected from orbital debris as well. Once again, alluding to your separate statements, I think there was a quote that estimated that 650,000 objects larger than a fingernail and 170 million pieces larger than 1 millimeter will eventually be out there traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. That's a lot of debris to avoid. How do you think about that from where you sit? Obviously, that's not solely your responsibility, but how does it fit into the overall regulatory landscape of the commission and how you regulate the satellites?
Well, it's a huge potential for enormous damage. and the orbital debris becomes a significant problem for those that are putting up 1,000, multiple thousands of satellites into the sky. Or into space, that is something that's going to have to be addressed. And I think it's multi-pronged, right? It's something the United States has to have an orbital debris policy, and I think that's something that's being worked on. It's probably not as far along as I would like it to be, but I think there's work to be done on that side of the equation. The second is, what do you do with the debris that's already there? How do you go about it? And I think that really is something, and I've been trying to explore some of the technological solutions that I think that were brought up in other forum too, is there are different techniques that are being contemplated for removing debris, as we, the numbers that you cite from my statements. Those things have to be addressed in some capacity. We also have, to be able to do long-term space exploration, we're going to pass through some of this orbital debris that we've caused. And there has to be consequences for those that caused the debris, and that's something we have to build on. We've done some of that at the FCC. We built it into some of the agreements or some of the approval process that they're going to comply with an orbital debris mechanism going forward. But we need to figure that out and get firm commitments on whether it be the financing side, whether it be in terms of what is their commitment to address what they may leave behind, knowing that some companies will not survive the marketplace.
Right. I mean, so you mentioned the large number of applicants that you currently have pending and not clear who's going to make it and who's going to not. There's all that interest and all that potential investment. At the same time, there's some companies who are saying, I have satellite spectrum, but I'd rather use it for terrestrial. How do you kind of square all that into one conversation about spectrum for satellites?
Well, I think that's the beauty of the market, right? The beauty of the marketplace. The market is pulling and pushing, what technology is hot at the given moment. Some people think it's low Earth, some think mid-Earth, and the MEO universe, and some people are committed to the GEOs, and the market is pulling that all apart as we speak in terms of what, the economics may or may not say long term. And so some companies are, contemplating what else they can offer, what their networks may be able to offer in addition to what they. And I'll give you an example. We spent a great deal of time, as many people know, on the issue of Globalstar. Right. And one of the things that they made very clear to us during the time, and it may have since changed. I've got a lot of things on my plate since that time, but I'll tell you, at the time they were very committed that they were going to continue to offer a satellite service. That it wasn't something that they weren't going to migrate completely to a terrestrial based structure. And so that's something that's important, and we're trying to figure out how that plays into spectrum policy. But I think the market's constantly pulling and pushing on what providers should do, and it affects the valuation of so many of our satellite companies. I mean, let's face it, the satellite industry has had some recent economic difficulties. But it's a very diverse and strong field. But it is it gets outshadowed by some other investments in certain high tech companies that gather everyone's attention. That's okay in the short term. Long term, we have to figure out what does that mean for survivability and the ability to grow and change going forward.
So you sort of alluded to that last conversation too, is that sometimes the United States policy is a little piecemeal when it comes to satellites versus terrestrials, and then you've got a work coming up that has some of these issues rolled into it. So how would you like to see the United States proceed, both in terms of work and as a general policy matter?
Well, look, I lived through WRC 15 or WARC 15, depending on which country you're sitting in at the moment, and I didn't really find that process too productive from a macro perspective, because it was a lot of agreement in the United States. You could argue there was definitely disagreement with the United States position, and then internationally it was flipped on its head, where it wasn't. The satellite industry had done its homework and was quite successful globally in blocking a lot of different things. And so it wasn't, at the end of the day, very productive from my perspective. And I worry that we're heading down the same path for WRC 19. I've advocated that there be a lot more cooperation and agreement reached in terms of the U.S. position, in terms of the position in CTEL, before we get to that point, so we don't wind up with the same outcome. If you do things twice in a row, I mean, it's problematic. And so I've spent a lot of time on WRC 19. My obligations have changed a little bit. I'm expecting a new daughter, so I don't have as much time as I once did. And so, it's yet to be seen if I'll be able to go, if my wife will let me go. But but the circumstance be, it's still an incredibly important issue that needs to be, thoughtfully considered. I will tell you, I've raised multiple before. I've raised problems with the ITU and how they have moved forward in both 15 and where they may be going in 19, and how they operate and how their structure facilitates outcomes. I'm incredibly troubled by a number of foreign nations who are acting in their parochial interest against the interest of the rest of the world, and are enticingly putting blocks in the way from progress. They will block the United States from moving forward, even if it's not to the detriment of their own country, for purposes of competitive reasons. And that can't be allowed to survive, in my opinion.
So I'll ask you one more question, then we'll open up
Sure.
to one audience question because we're running tight on time. But according to SI, in 2016, U.S. satellite industries, $100 billion in revenue, 42% of the global market, over 200,000 jobs created. The president has his memorandum calling for American leadership in space commerce. I know that's not binding on you, but I just want to throw that out there. So how do you help ensure U.S. leadership writ large, especially at the FCC, including things like making sure that satellite carriers want to be U.S. flagged?
Well, I think there are tremendous benefits to be part of the, and be flagged by in my opinion, the greatest country that has ever existed on the face of the world. And so I think there are benefits. We are trying to make our process more efficient and streamlined, and the International Bureau and the Commission have done a wonderful job starting that process and moving things forward to make it easier to get through the licensing process, to work easier through the ITU process. There are, advantages in some instances, and I've highlighted ITU problems. There are advantages in some circumstances where you can get flagged in other countries easier, and that shouldn't exist. And we're working through those issues, and the good staff is trying to work through to make it a more level playing field for the United States, and that we don't have companies seeking to be flagged elsewhere for no other reason than process. And I think that's something but I think we are still going to have a very robust and dynamic U.S. industry focused on satellite services. You saw a number of the providers. They're here on the panel. Many of them have a global presence, but have a heavy role in the United States. And I think that will continue to play throughout whatever circumstances happen.
Great. Thank you. So we'll take one question from the audience because we don't have a ton of time. Oh, there's one over there somewhere. Oh, there we go. Yep. Can we get a mic to him maybe? There it goes.
Hi, Caleb Henry again with Space News. My question is about space debris, which you're talking about. So the FCC has done a lot with space debris, but ultimately you mentioned it's kind of a little weird. It does fall into managing space things. Should the FCC be handling space debris, or do you think that should be somebody else's responsibility?
Well, it is not something that's completely in the FCC's bailiwick. It's not something we have a role in that equation. Like I said, I think it's something we've made part of our approval process. But it is still tied to a larger plan by the United States government that we're a part of, and we'll have those conversations and be negotiating with different entities to make sure that we come up with the right policy. But I think that it's still something that needs to be done cooperatively. We're unlikely to be the sole designee in terms of deciding orbital debris issues, and it's going to require not just policy, but it's also going to require, as I think I alluded to, the technology side of the equation. What can be done to that's already there? It's one thing to say for the new satellites, what are we going to do to prevent their cause, and if they were to demise in some instances, what's the impact? And we have worked on that. But it's also, what are we going to do with the space that's already, the debris that's already there? And if I really worry about that. Probably a little bit more than I do about the new systems going up, even though there are quite a number of satellites within the constellations.
Great. With that, I want to thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly, for joining us, and thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. Have a good rest of your day.